Hello and welcome to Salome's Writer Therapy, where you and your writing connect. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about tropes. What they are, how we use them in stories, and specifically how you can make them your own. And as always, to help you choose the best way to write the tropes you want, I've created a free resource which I've linked in the description below. So grab your favorite beverage and a cozy spot, and let's dive into today's episode. What is a trope? A trope is a story element or device that has a familiar pattern or makeup that most readers would recognize. It is also the term used for popular and familiar genre conventions. Now, here are some examples: the chosen one, a love triangle, the mentor, rags to riches, hero's journey, damsel in distress, the redemption arc, villain monologue, meet cute, forbidden love, the anti-hero, and so on. The thing with a trope is that when you hear its name, most people understand the pattern it follows or what its makeup is, like the chosen one. We understand that it follows a central character who is often unsuspecting, who is destined to save the world or fulfill a significant role. Examples include Harry Potter in the Harry Potter series and Neo in The Matrix. Now, some of these examples that I've listed might have made you cringe a little bit on the inside. Maybe like that villain monologue, right? That is because some tropes, some of these story elements, have been so overused in the past that readers are tired of seeing them in stories. And that is when a trope can become a cliche. Now, just for clarification, not all tropes are cliches, and some tropes might seem cliche to you and not to someone else. The thing is, you can write an engaging and interesting trope, whether it's a cliche or not. Now, before we go into how to write these tropes without being cliche or boring, let's talk about different types of tropes. Alright, so as I said before, a trope has a familiar pattern or makeup to it, right? Now, this is what I mean when I refer to different types of tropes. Some tropes are just one element in your story, like the villain monologue or a meet cute, while others are a combination of elements or events, like the chosen one or the redemption arc. There are various places in your story where you'll find these tropes, and I'm going to break it down for you in a second, and it's also in the free resource below. Now, it's good to know where you find the tropes, because then you'll know what you need to look out for when you use them. Remember, as I always say, everything is connected. So let's see how tropes are connected to your story. Okay, so I'm going to separate the tropes into 4 types: character type, plot type, setting type, and structure type. This way, you'll know where to focus when you're plotting or writing the trope. Now, as you'll see, some of these tropes, like the ones that have multiple elements, remember like the chosen one or the redemption arc, will cross over multiple types, and that's okay. It just means that the trope is more complex and has room for various fresh interpretations from the writer. Now let's look at the character type. These tropes are all related to the characters, their relationships, and their development. So they might have to do with the character's personality, their role in the story, their growth or change throughout the story, or the interactions they have with other characters. Examples of character type tropes are like the chosen one, the mentor, the damsel in distress, love triangle, enemies to lovers, the meet cute, anti-hero, forbidden love, found family, redemption arc, and so on. The next one is the plot type. These tropes are specifically related to the plot and its progression that you've created for your story. So these tropes require events or circumstances in your plot in order to fit those patterns or makeup that is the trope. Examples are the chosen one, rags to riches, fish out of water, time travel, the redemption arc, the villain monologue, found family, and so on. Now, if this all feels a bit overwhelming, don't worry, all of this is also in the free resource in the description below. So the next type is the setting type. These tropes are heavily dependent on the setting of your story. So you might have to determine the tropes you want to use before you plot or write your setting. Examples of this would be the fish out of water or the time travel tropes, and so on. The next type is the structure type. These tropes have a direct impact on the structure you choose in your story, so they will in some ways determine how you write the story because there are expectations of what needs to happen when in your story. Examples are like the hero's journey, enemies to lovers, or any other romance-related tropes, and so on. So look at the tropes in your story and check to see what type of trope it is or where you'll usually find it. Is it character-related, plot, setting, or structure-related, or is it a combination? This way, you won't miss any parts of the trope when you're plotting or writing. Because like with the example of the chosen one, you need a specific kind of character to fit that trope, so it's a character type, but you also need a very specific kind of plot for it to be the chosen one trope, so it's also a plot type. So by knowing the type of trope, you will know what is expected from the trope for it to work and where you can play around to make it your own. Alright, so just a quick word on the expectation of tropes. Just as with genre, tropes also have certain reader expectations that you need to be aware of. Now, I'm not going to go into it as there are hundreds of tropes out there and to cover each will take forever. My only suggestion here would be to do your research on what expectations there are for the tropes you want to use in your story. Just because you'd want to follow the expectations doesn't mean that it will be boring, predictable, or formulaic. It all comes down to how you write it. So let's talk about that. How can you write a trope that is fresh, engaging, interesting, and not a cliche? Now, here are some tips on how you can do that thoughtfully and with your overall story in mind. Now, the first tip is to understand tropes. Familiarize yourself with common tropes in your chosen genre. This understanding will help you use them effectively. The second tip is to consider how you can subvert trope expectations to surprise and engage your audience. So if the traditional trope is based on a female character, you can subvert it or flip it to be about a male character. Something as simple as that would subvert the trope expectations and will be a surprise to engage your audience. The third tip is, instead of using a trope in its traditional form, try combining it with other tropes or adding a unique twist. This can result in a fresh and interesting narrative. The next tip is to use tropes as a foundation for your characters, but then remember to develop them beyond that stereotypical trait that's associated with the trope. Give your characters depth and complexity. The next tip is to be intentional about using tropes. Consider whether a trope serves your story or if its inclusion is actually unnecessary. Tropes can be very powerful tools if they are used purposefully. So don't just add a trope for the sake of adding a trope. Make sure that it's connected to your story, that it works inside the framework of the story that you've created, and you don't just put it in because you want to have a trope in your story. Make sure that it fits. Be intentional about using tropes. The next tip is to know your audience and what they enjoy. Some readers may appreciate a classic trope, while others may be looking for something more innovative. The thing is, you need to know your audience because you are writing the story for them, right? So do a little bit of research if you can about what types of tropes your audience would enjoy and see how you can include that in your story. But don't just include them for the audience. Make sure, as I've said in one of the previous points, that it actually needs to be there, that it works with the overall story. But just keep your audience in mind. The next tip is to aim for balance between the familiar element, which will be the trope, and originality. Striking this balance can make your story both engaging and relatable, because the trope is the familiar element and people can relate to it because they understand that pattern or the trope's makeup, right? But if you add an original twist into it or original idea, then that balance will make it so much more engaging. The next tip is to analyze how successful authors have used tropes in their works. Understand why certain tropes resonate with readers and how they've been adapted to create memorable stories. The point of this tip is not to copy other authors. You want to get inspired by them, to see how they twist things around. What kind of things do they do to make a trope interesting or memorable? And see how you can do the same with your own tropes. And then the last tip is to share your work with others and gather feedback. Now, I know this one is a bit difficult for the newbie writers out there because to share your work is a vulnerable thing, right? But if you share your work and get feedback on the tropes that you've used, then you might understand how your use of tropes is being received and if any adjustments are needed. That's the only way that you can actually grow as a writer, is to get feedback. The idea here is to see how you can take tropes and mold it into your story so that it makes it more vibrant and more engaging, and also relatable, because your readers will see the trope or the pieces of the trope that you've used and will know what that entails. And then you can surprise them, or you can add twists. And by getting feedback, you will see where you did it right and where you will need to make adjustments. And it's not a bad thing to have to make adjustments. All critiques aren't always positive, right? But the thing to remember is, if you can take the feedback that you get and use it to learn and to grow and to become better, then that feedback wasn't necessarily negative. Just remember that tropes, when used thoughtfully, can enhance your storytelling. The key is to use them as tools to support your narrative rather than relying on them as a crutch. And tropes can also be helpful when you're creating the key elements of your story: conflict, character, plot, and setting. And I've listed a playlist of those episodes down below, so you can go check that out as well. As I said, everything is connected. Every part of your story, every element that you add into your story has to be connected to the others. So if you're starting out, you can use tropes to help you create your conflict, your character, your plot, and your setting. Use the tropes as a starting point and then build from there. Remember, the effectiveness of tropes depends on how they're used and subverted within a story. While the examples in this episode are common examples, skilled writers find ways to breathe new life into them or use them as a foundation for innovative storytelling. And that's what I want to impart here with you, that you can take a basic trope and make it brand new. Don't be afraid to add tropes to your story, because it will add that sense of the familiar. And as long as you can balance it with originality, then you're good to go. And remember, check out that free resource in the description below that will help you to plot or write your tropes so that they are engaging, interesting, and connected to your overall story. So that's it for today's episode. If you found it helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell. And if you have a question or future episode suggestions, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. So until next time, may your creativity flow freely and your fingers dance upon the keys. Keep writing with joy and stay connected. Cheers.